Hello everyone, welcome back to another episode of r/ProRevenge. In today's episode, so you'll force me to do what's in the office's best interests? Don't go in the house with your muddy shoes. Okay. You want to track my time? Fine. Before we get started, make sure to subscribe so you will never miss a video. So, let's get started. So you'll force me to do what's in the office's best interests? I'm a clerk at a civil court in Brazil. Both my wife and I applied for a position in the same region through the same entrance examination, but since my grade was better than hers, I wound up getting the job before she got hers. The region comprises City A, larger and safer, and City B, smaller with a high crime rate, which are about 10 miles apart. I got the job at a civil court in City A, and I chose to work the last shift, 11 to 19. Other shifts are 9 to 17 and 10 to 18. Most clerks choose to work the first shift, and directors tend to value clerks who work the last shift. My office had 5 clerks in the first shift, 5 clerks in the last shift, and none in the 10 to 18. My director was a very stern man. Our bylaws allow for a few perks which he would often forsake due to what he claimed it's what's in the office's best interests. He would ask people not to take vacations. He would get mad at people calling sick with doctor's notes. We have 6 yearly full paid absences which he would not let us take. Even though we're allowed to clock in up to 15 minutes late 5 times a month with no penalty, he would shame people for doing it and order them to clock out late. He never really trained or assigned someone to train me, just started shoving tasks on me. He would order people to clock out and stay after hours, so they wouldn't get comp hours. When I had my vasectomy and my doctor gave me 2 days off because of an issue, he called me to go to work in the same day and threatened to write me up when I refused, heavily implying that I forged my doctor's note. I think you get the gist of it. What always baffled me is that himself and every worker in the office, and we had a lot of clerks there, was being paid by the state, yet he acted like he was paying us out of his own pocket and doing us a favor letting us work under him. He also had a reputation for his sternness among his peers. Most directors are pretty chill people, since they're basically glorified supervisors. Not this one. Whatever. I kept doing my work diligently. I've worked retail, nothing scares me anymore. About 1 year later, my wife got the job at City B, and she could only do the 11 to 19 shift because her department had very few people at that shift. She couldn't drive, is terrified of, and buses from my house or City A to City B are sparse, have lots of robbery reports, and are basically motorized horse wagons. None of her co-workers lived anywhere close to my house or City A's courthouse, so, basically, we could either waste a lot of money on Uber, or I had to leave her in City B, go back to City A, work 8 hours, go back to City B, and then go back home, wasting a total of about 2.5 hours driving in the process, which was what we were doing for 2 months. Right up to the point when she nearly got mugged. Clerks are not allowed to stay in City B's courthouse building after 1900 hours, so she had to wait for me about 40 minutes in the street, where shit almost happened if it weren't for a late leaving police officer. After that happened, I absolutely had to change my working hours to an hour earlier, 10 to 18, so I could be there when she got out. I explained everything to my director and he scoffed. Said it was not his problem. That it's not in the office's best interests that I changed my shift, even though there were 4 clerks aside from me working the same shift, 2 are usually what most departments get, he would have double, and it apparently wasn't enough, and none working the 10 to 18. So my wife started taking an Uber back home, which was a big financial hit on us, it ate about 1/3 her incomes. My wife's director suggested that I switched workplaces with another person from City B, so, provided that the court president approved, he always did, and that my director signed a document agreeing with the change, that person would then work at City A, and I would work at City B. As luck would have it, one of my wife's co-workers has been trying to work at City A for 2 years, so I already had someone to switch places with. I talked about it with my director and, after 2 weeks postponing an answer, you guessed, he told me it was not in the office's best interests. When I insisted, his reasoning was, you know how to work here and a new person wouldn't know, so you absolutely need to stay here. Never mind that the new person was also a clerk at a civil court, so the work was basically the same. I asked him what the hell was I supposed to do since we were losing quite a lot of money, and he wouldn't allow me to either change my shift or my workplace, and he said, very sarcastically, that I could complain to the judge, and I was to stop bothering him with my personal drama. He knew my judge wouldn't even meet a newbie clerk, much less believe me. My wife relayed that info to her director, and he was astonished. But he had an idea. Tell it to the judge, you say? So my wife's director explained everything to his court's judge, who in turn had a long phone call with my court's judge. She politely asked him to let me switch, and told him about my director's habit of ignoring our bylaws. The next day, the judge shows up in my department. My director, ironically, is late. Judge is asking the senior clerks questions about my director. Most of them try to avoid answering. He seems to understand everything. Director arrives, is all smiles when he sees the judge in our office instead of his own, and is greeted with a "What the hell do you think you're doing?" The room freezes. Judge rants for about 10 minutes about how employees should be free to do what our bylaws allow, and that if my director was so adamant about not signing the document for my switching, he would do it himself while signing my director's demotion. He wasn't supposed to stop people from doing what is specifically allowed in our bylaws, and he has been many a time ordered to, I quote, "stop treating court clerks as goddamn retail clerks." Some people were really fed up with my director, and this public ass-chewing finally grew a spine on them, because they started telling the judge things he did. Most people quoted his "it's in the office's best interests" policy, and the judge got livid after hearing about it for the third time. "You don't get to decide what's better for the office. I get to decide what's better for the office because it's my office and every single one of you works under my authority," he yelled, his red face a few inches from my director's face. Good, now we have a power tripper publicly power tripping a power tripper. After some more yelling, the judge leaves. My director is floored. He basically sits on his chair and glares at me. I can see it in his eyes, he will get back at me hard. There's indistinct chatter among the clerks about filing a formal complaint. The judge, however, comes back after about 10 minutes with a sheet of paper in hand and walks in my direction. If I weren't a public worker, I would think I was about to be fired. He bluntly asks me, "Are you sure you want to go to City B?" I can only nod. He has a very powerful presence. I later learned that he used to work in the army. He gives me the paper. It's the document I needed a signature from my director, signed by the judge himself. It's already signed by my wife's director and the person who would switch with me. It's only missing my signature. Judge says sign it and take the rest of the day off as a paid leave. You're to work in City B as of tomorrow. I stammer, but wasn't I supposed to wait for the court president's approval? And he glares at me. I am a judge. If I say go, you go. You don't have to say it twice, my lord, my liege, my demigod. I thank him profusely, say my goodbyes to my co-workers, and I go to my director. I look him dead in the eye. You were right. The complaint thing did work to my best interests. His face contorts in what some subreddits would call a cat butt face. The next day, I started working at City B's court under what's probably the best director one could ever ask for. With the blessing of working with my wife, we're allowed to as long as we have the same job. My current director is basically the antithesis of my previous one, very reasonable and non-confrontational. A former co-worker kept me informed of the fallout. He told me that 5 other people, himself included, requested to switch to other courts the following days, and the director was forced to sign for them all. No immediate switching like mine, though. Since director is an appointed position by the court's judge, he was demoted to chief clerk by the end of that week, and the former chief clerk, a lovely woman, got his job. He tried to flaunt power at the newcomers, and his new director put an end to it very quickly by giving him a 30-day suspension. Don't go in the house with your muddy shoes. Okay. I've been sitting on this story for a long time, and I'd like to share it with you. Even if this seems like a minor incident, it satisfied my years-long appetite for revenge. I can't list all of the nasty things she said to me and my family, but take my word for it. This story comes from a few years back, before my grandmother was bedridden because of severe Alzheimer's. You see, after my grandfather died in the early 80s, my grandmother and her youngest sister moved in together. The youngest sister was, and is, an unpleasant woman in my humble opinion. I doubt she is well loved among the family either. My dad thinks her behavior to my grandma somewhat sped up the process of her Alzheimer's. I'm fuzzy on the details of when this took place, but my dad decided, as a family, we should take my grandma on a holiday on the Greek islands to give her some breathing room from her sister's shenanigans. We spent about a week on Chios and went back to my grandmother's summer house. There was an infrastructural work of some kind just outside the garden gates, which meant there was a big trench with the dirt shoveled on either end. Since my dad had back problems, I had to carry a significant chunk of the suitcases. So, I picked up 2 big suitcases and my backpack and walked up to the garden gates where my grandmother's sister greeted us. The first thing she told me, not even a proper greeting, and I quote as well as I can, "Don't walk into the house with your muddy shoes, I just swept up." We packed up and drove all day. I was exhausted and angsty, and this gave me a chance to have my small but fair revenge. So, I complied. I walked up to the trench, took off my shoes and threw them over the trench in front of her, and hopped over the trench, in my socks covered in mud with 2 heavy suitcases in my hands and a bag on my back, and went inside the house. I put the luggage inside and went for the second run, all the while she watched with her mouth agape in shock. My dad questioned me before bedtime, and I told him I did what I was told. I didn't go in with my muddy shoes, just muddy socks. He agreed but told me not to do it again. I wasn't grounded. I could tell from his voice, my dad was as amused as me. Not to mention my mother was standing beside my dad and giggling during the conversation. As for my grandmother's sister, she didn't talk to me for weeks, which I thoroughly enjoyed. You want to track my time? Fine. Earlier this summer I temporarily took a job as a roofing salesperson for a construction company. The job description said I was managing a book of insurance agents and realtors, working referrals. In the interview, the boss was adamant that there was no door knocking, just working relationships and referrals. I took the job and came to learn about a week into my hire that they expected 5+ hours a day of door knocking. I could have quit right away, but I figured I'd give it a go for a bit and just see how things went. The job was full commission with a small weekly vehicle allowance, and I wasn't responsible for working a regular schedule. But eventually my boss started expecting everyone to work a regular schedule and report at least 40 hours on T-sheets. I fought with him about it because as a non-hourly or non-salary employee, there was nothing to report. I got paid only for the work I brought in. Whether I worked 80 or 5 hours, the pay was the same and there was no contractual obligation to my time. He got upset that I didn't just give in. So he told me that because I hadn't filled out a time card, they wouldn't give me my weekly vehicle allowance. It's not a huge amount of money, but it was a matter of principle. I don't get paid for time worked, so why do they need to know my hours? My best friend is a labor attorney, and I asked him what I could do, and he said I should just threaten calling the Department of Labor for withholding wages. So I told my boss I'd call the Department of Labor. At this point, I was already in the process of getting hired for a job I really wanted. So I was planning on quitting soon anyway, so I figured they had it coming for all the lies and deceitful nature of literally everything. They ended up giving me the allowance, and then later that day, HR then rolled out a policy that said that they are now paying out the allowance based on hours logged on T-sheets. It was the expectation that we'd log 40 hours, and if you don't meet 40 hours, they will deduct a prorated amount from the vehicle allowance. The policy also said it was retroactive for the previous week. So, I didn't get my allowance for that week's pay as I continued to not log everything. I was a little PO'd about it. Here's the malicious compliance. That week, our boss made us work about 90 hours, commuting several hours a day each way, to a town he wanted us to get some work in. I went into T-sheets and logged 90 hours for the week. When the pay came that week, I only got the regular allowance for 40 hours. I asked my boss where the rest was, and he said it was a flat rate. So I cited the new policy and said he owed me based on the hours worked, and I'd be calling the DOL if I didn't get it. They ended up giving me the allowance based on 90 hours, and later that week HR emailed the department saying full commission people are exempt from logging hours and would be receiving the flat pay. I win. I ended up quitting a short time later, followed by pretty much the wholesale staff. If you made it to the end of the video, thanks for watching. Don't forget to like, subscribe and share, and we will see you in the next video.